Hey guys, it's Ty with Ty the Dog Guy on the Daily, and I want to talk today about flooding. And no, I'm not talking about what happened down in Louisiana here recently, or Texas, or whatever. I'm talking about flooding as a term, a psychological term for what happens when we're faced with a lot of stress. Now, if you listen to, it was probably yesterday's, if not, it was a recent one, a recent podcast and vlog that I did on counter conditioning. I mentioned that counter conditioning, when you're dealing with a fear that a dog has, can oftentimes only get you so far. Because maybe the threshold is too big, maybe the dog's fear is too big, maybe the motivators that they have just aren't big enough. And so it's not feasible and it's not realistic to use counter conditioning to try to get the dog entirely over a fear. But where counter conditioning can often leave off, sometimes flooding can be good. Now, flooding is it's one of these things. It's a tool to kind of help a dog. Now, like any tool, it can be used properly. It can be used improperly. But what flooding is essentially is saying, here is something that you're afraid of, and you can't run away from it. So what are you going to do? I think it's been called I think it might have been called like immersion therapy. So the flooding and immersion therapy and things like that have been done with human subjects over the years and still is done to this day. If somebody's afraid of snakes, they're put into a room with snakes. And so when the mind is confronted with something that's terrifying or nerve-wracking, the mind really has two options, right? It can adapt, or die. Let me step back for a bit, because there are more options. There's fight, flight, or avoidance. But let's say, for example, that the opportunity to fight isn't there. It's been taken away. The opportunity to flight isn't there. It's been taken away, to flee. And so in a situation like that, the dog can either adapt to that scenario or it can die. And I know that sounds really extreme, and I don't mean it as an extreme, because really you or your dog's not going to die. I mean, I guess in theory, someone could be put into a room with snakes and they're so terrified that they have a heart attack and die. So in theory, that could happen. But in reality, what flooding can do, flooding is, as a rule, is not going to cause death. So what can it cause? It can cause adaptation. And the question is, how does it cause adaptation? When I say adaptation, what I'm referring to is the dog learning to cope with the stress, or in this case, like I say, the human learning to cope with the stress, or the dog learning to cope with the stress. So in the example I was using of my client in my last podcast, talking about counter conditioning, I talked about a dog who's afraid of men. And especially, as the man's coming over the top to pet the dog and things like that. And so we talked about how to counter condition. But the dog's also afraid of, if the man makes a sudden move in the house or things like that. So it's something that you can also counter condition, that you can have the man move and feed the dog, move a little bit more, feed the dog, and so forth. But it's also something that you could use flooding with. And flooding would be saying, okay, dog, you're going to go over to the bed. Now, this particular dog is not a fight type of dog. She's not a dog that gets aggressive. But we're going to say, okay, you're going to go over to the bed, and we're going to work on a place command. So we're going to work on obedience such that you understand that you have to stay put in that bed. And so when this man walks past, and we're not going to throw tons at you and make it so unbelievably difficult, but we know that men going past you scares you. So we're going to have this man walk past. You don't want to fight. You might want to flee. You might want to go into the flight mode, but we're not going to allow you. You have to stay in your bed. So what options are left? You adapt to the man walking past, or you die, essentially. But again, the dog's not going to die. That's not a real option. But really, those are the only two options. You adapt or you don't. And the lack of adaptation is dying. And like I said, the dog's not going to do that. The dog's not going to just sit there and keel over because a man walked past. And so what happens with flooding like this is the dog has to learn how to adapt. Now, initially, when dogs are adapting, they'll often go into avoidance. Now, what avoidance is the dog looking away, maybe getting a little bit shut down, although being shut down and being avoidant are typically two different things, or can be two different things. But the dog will often look away and kind of pretend the problem's not there. But that's where with flooding we do repetition, 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 and the dog starts to realize nothing bad ever happens. Every time that guy walks past, nothing bad ever happens, and often you can even include some counter conditioning, so you have the guy throw some food. And so if you can do flooding combined with counter conditioning, what you'll often find is that the dog's like, well, nothing bad ever happens. And as a matter of fact, something good really happens. And so this is where we can take a balanced approach to helping a fearful dog and say, all right, you can't react poorly to the fear. You can't be aggressive, although this dog doesn't want to be, but let's say the dog wanted to be, we correct that. You can't be aggressive. You can't run away. And so you must adapt. If you wish to use avoidance as an adaptation step, that's great. But like I say, very few dogs will remain in avoidance long term. Avoidance is just a short-term step towards them getting further along in the process and saying, this is not a bad thing. I can do this. And so from flooding, from proper flooding, you'll often find proper flooding combined with counter conditioning, you'll often find a dog gets stronger, like mentally stronger, able to deal with stress, able to deal with conflict so much better because they recognize that, hey, I don't have to feel this way. And they start feeling a different way. Now, again, it takes, sometimes it's a few repetitions, sometimes it's a lot. But flooding combined with counter conditioning or just flooding by itself, when it's done properly, can do very well. Now, improper flooding would be things like where we don't follow through, to where the dog like runs away and we allow the dog to run away and say, oh, the dog's afraid, let me just let it run away. That's like mental atrophy. That's just the dog going backwards, Or improper flooding would be throwing way too much at the dog. Let's say instead of the guy walking past, the guy runs up right next to her and gets in her face. That would be improper flooding. That's way too much for the dog to handle. And that could very well push the dog into a fight response or something like that. And so anyways, but proper flooding, where we say, here, you need to deal with this, but I'm going to give you options. You can lie in your bed. You can pay attention to me. Hey, here's some food. But we give you options for how to deal with it, is one of the best ways I've ever seen to help a dog cope with stress and fear once we have that solid foundation of obedience. So hopefully that helps you with your dog with fear problems.